If you protest, get tested. That is the message from New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo, one of the public officials concerned about the fight against COVID-19. Images like these from Philadelphia have some public health officials concerned. The U.S. is approaching 2 million confirmed cases. More than 110,000 Americans have died. About 20,000 new cases are confirmed each day. Let's bring back Janelle Ross, Michael Starr Hopkins, and Jamel Hill. Also joining us now is Dr. Lipi Roy, an internal medicine physician and NBC News medical contributor. And doctor, I'm so glad you're right there. I can look at you. You're a person.
It's so weird, right? Human interaction.
It's the latest thing, all the rage. Well, since you're a human here and I can interact with you, I'd love to know your sense about this tension between social justice and social distancing. Politico reported on this letter that more than 1,000 health workers have signed, saying that the protests are worth the risk of a spike in COVID-19 cases. We've also heard that from a number of the protesters. How do you see it?
Yeah, well, I share your sentiments, Joshua. It's good to be here with you in person. Look, I have mixed feelings about this because on one hand, we in the medical profession, we do believe that racism is a public health crisis, actually. And the two issues, the protests and coronavirus, they're not really mutually exclusive phenomena. We've been saying now for months that it's so important to keep that physical distance. And yet, unfortunately, because of the recent events, people have this urge to protest. And I'm all for activism. The recommendations, though, are still, you can still be an activist at home. That's what I firmly believe. Protesting is important, but for those who still feel that they need to be out there, please wear a mask. Try to keep that physical distance as best as you can. Try not to shout because that'll spread the respiratory droplets even further. But I feel very strongly that this is an important issue. It's also a health issue. It's a social justice issue. We
just saw pictures of you out protesting, and New York's Mayor Bill de Blasio is also among those encouraging protesters to get tested. Here's what he had to say.
We need to remind people it is always free, it's easy, it's fast, and it's coming to you. If you have been at one of these protests, I want to strongly urge you to get tested. It has been a real concern that people have gathered in close proximity.
Doctor, one of the other concerns, I think, is that people might get this false sense of security about immunity, this idea of herd immunity. We don't yet know, I think, whether or not being exposed to coronavirus once confers immunity on you. It could be like the flu, where every season it's a little bit different.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Joshua. Again, as I've said before to you many times, this is a novel virus, right? We really just discovered this in November of last year. There's so much more that we need to learn, unlike, say, influenza, which we've known about for centuries. And one of the pieces of data that that the jury is still out on is whether, getting an infection confers immunity. And we don't think that's the case. So that's why it's doubly important that if you're around other people, if you're congregating, as these protesters are, to try to practice preventive health measures. And like the mayor said, it's actually, we would recommend self-quarantining after you are in a protest situation, and then, yes, get tested. But my concern is that a lot of I'm inspired by seeing so many young people at these protests, but remember, the data shows that it's not the young people who are actually going to get severely sick and die.
Right.
They'll get infected, and my concern is that they're going to expose older relatives, family members, neighbors, and they're the ones who are going to get severely sick and die.
Michael, before we go, very briefly, where do we go from here with what could be a public health crisis and, of course, what's a public safety crisis? What do you think are the next steps from here, very briefly?
I think we've got to hold everyone accountable. I think we need to restore the Voting Rights Act. I think we need to hold police accountable and talk about the fact that as a 14-year-old, I had my first interaction with police where they put a gun in my face. That's not the life that Americans should live in this country.
Michael Starr Hopkins, Dr. Lipi Roy, Janelle Ross, thank you all very much for being with us. Much appreciated. Jamel Hill, please do stick around. There's more that we want to talk to you about these protests that are certainly not slowing down. We're following a number of images across the country. You are looking at Los Angeles right now. We're keeping an eye on those protests, which have remained quite peaceful this evening. Also, the NFL is coming out in support of these protests. But do you remember what the league used to say about taking a knee? What changed? That's next.